Well, welcome. Turn to Matthew chapter 12. I've been finding this is a difficult subject to deal with that we have been looking at, and probably wouldn't have gotten into it except it was in the flow of the study of the passage, which is chapter 12, of course, of the book of Matthew. And we're right in the middle of this whole idea what can be forgiven and what can't be forgiven, and what the need of our life really is. And it's a very strong truth. And the difficulty I've been finding with the passage itself is the fact not that it's really that complicated. In fact, now I've gone back, since we've done a lot of the verses. By the way, we're looking at verse 34 tonight of chapter 12, verse 34. And since we've dealt with a lot of these verses, I've actually gone back this week and kind of revamped and re-looked at and tried to give handles on the previous verses. So I'm going to give you a new outline, and this will be maybe even more teaching than preaching. I'm not sure what the difference is. You yell on either one of them, so it doesn't matter, I guess. But here we are anyhow. So I want to walk you through this again. And again, it's not that this is so complicated, but what I'm finding is that there's so much garbage in my mind from what I've heard, what I've been taught, what others have said, that it's hard to get over all of that and really learn and see and come through in clarity about what He is doing and saying to us. So we're attempting to do that, and I want to try to give you some handles on it again tonight. So let's bow in prayer. Jesus, we love you, and we want truth, regardless of what it does to us. We don't want to hide. We don't want to cover up. We're not trying to justify. Lord, whatever you want to say, whatever you need to do in our lives and in our hearts, we are wide open to it. And we're saying, Jesus, please, please communicate to us in this hour through your word. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. We are constantly giving you the context of this passage, which is absolutely essential. And the context is found in the four ideas that are presented in the chapter. There are four situations that are found in the chapter. And we've labeled those the controversy in the grain field, which is verse 1 down through verse 8. And the focus of that, of course, is that the disciples have picked grain on the Sabbath day. And in verse 2, you will notice that the Pharisees are saying, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. And I never can read that verse without pointing a finger. Look! you got to have the finger. You got to, and it needs to be a long one, so you may need to get a finger stretcher. But look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. So that's the issue, is the activity that they are doing and the fact that it broke the Sabbath day law. And again, you'll remember this is so severe and so strong that it was punishable by death, so they could carry stones, of course, on the Sabbath day and stone people to death. But you couldn't pick grain. So you come to verse 9 then, which is the second scene, which gives us, again, and it's more of the same, basically, only this time it's the controversy in the synagogue. And you'll note in verse 10, it even says that they did all of this that they might accuse him. And of course, the question is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? They didn't look at restoring a man's life. And Jesus, of course, never healed anybody physically, that he didn't also touch him spiritually, so that there was a complete wholeness within the individual himself when Jesus got done. But they didn't consider that. All they considered healing on the Sabbath day to be was a medical procedure, and of course that could wait till the next day. So you got that whole controversy, which is just we've gone from the grain field, we've gone to the synagogue with the same identical controversy. And then you go to verse 14, and goes down through verse 21, because a prophecy gets involved in it. And it's the controversy of the conference room. And of course the Pharisees in verse 14 have gone to the conference room, and they're strategizing how they are going to actually destroy him. Which again, you remember the word destroy is not, slap his hand. It's not, we'll take his credentials. It's not that kind of thing. It's absolutely eliminate, wipe out, do away with, abolish, end his life. So this is really, really strong. And while all of that is going on in verse 14, what is Jesus doing? Oh, more of the same. It's just who he is. He's out healing all the multitudes on the Sabbath day, and hundreds of miracles are being done. And of course, he's simply saying, don't tell anybody, because he doesn't have any hidden agenda, not trying to build any kind of fame in all of this, but just trying to minister and has a concern for people. Then you come to the scene that we're actually dealing with, which is really interesting because it seems to be, again, more of the same, only more severe and something of a climax in the whole thing. And it is the fact that a demon-possessed man has been healed in verse 22, and we move into the controversy in the theological classroom, because they're going to enter into a theological discussion here, and it goes all the way down through into verse 37, from 22 through verse 37. So a demon-possessed man has been healed, and of course the crowds go wild, thinking this might be the Messiah, is their suggestion. And Jesus, or the Pharisees, when they hear that, begin to realize that their power with the crowd is ebbing away, and they've got to stop this. And so they contradict what the crowd is saying and say this interesting statement in verse 24. This fella does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. And of course we discovered Beelzebub is the god of flies and gnats and manure, which is their attempt to go to the lowest, the worst, the filthiest, the most degraded of all of the demonics, and latch onto him and say that Jesus is on this low, low ebb. So that's what you've got going on. Now Jesus in verse 22 takes over. And we've been walking through this discourse of how he answers that and what he has to say. And again, I'm trying to put handles on this for you so that you'll be able to think it through more carefully through this means. In verse 25, down through verse 30, you have the first section. And I'm calling it the sensibility of logic. He says, you didn't go for the theology thing. You didn't go for the Bible thing. I gave you verses back in the first incident in the grain field deal. Gave you verses, told you Old Testament stories that you would be totally familiar with. Gave you all that insight, and you just blew it off. You just had nothing to, you didn't comprehend it. And I'm not going to do that again. What I want to do is I'm just going to walk you through a logical thought process. And what he gives them is just basic, fundamental sense. And he brings up this whole idea of a kingdom divided against itself can't stand, which just makes total sense. He ends up in verse 29 by talking about if you're going to go into a strong man's house and steal from him, it would be wise to first of all tie the guy up. Otherwise, you're going to be into trouble. So, he's just laying out pure, absolute logic. But, of course, you know that doesn't do them any good at all. Because you realize that in the realm of the spiritual life, arguments never solve the problem. If you have a spiritual problem, I can argue with you about spiritual things and argue Bible with you and argue theology with you, and you never win an argument, a theological argument, you never win. Because it isn't based on logic and think your way through, although you certainly want to do that in relationship to theology. But there's something about the heart. There's something about the Spirit of God coming to relate to the inner heart that really is the key to the whole thing. And Jesus is going to move into that. And he's going to talk about that. And he's setting it all up by saying, here's the logic, which isn't going to do you any good. Because if I could reason you into this, we would have already done that. And you would already be buying into what I am and who I am and what's happening through my life. And you'd already see me as the Messiah. And your life would already be changed. But obviously all the arguments aren't going to pull that off. So the Spirit of God himself, the issue is deeper than that. And he goes beyond that. And so in this first section, he deals with the sensibility of logic. Now, verse 31, as we've been suggesting through the weeks, is a climax to this whole thing. And we're calling it the supposition of truth, because it is the theme. He's establishing a great principle. He's giving the big idea of the whole message. He's built up to this, and now everything is going to flow out of this. So what you've got going on in the verses that surround 25 to 30 and 32 to 37 all rotate out of and have their meaning and sense from this one single verse. And it is a powerful, powerful verse. And it is the verse that seems to be the most controversy in the whole passage. Again, it's a climax, and he starts with this great idea of there is always, always, always forgiveness. Every sin and every blasphemy will be forgiven men. There is always forgiveness. There's no problem with forgiveness, folks. If you need forgiveness, don't ever worry about it. There is always forgiveness. And we've been discussing the idea that if you come to me and say, what is the unpardonable sin? And I'm hoping you're thinking your way through this and clarity is coming to us. If you come to me and say, what is the unpardonable sin in the Bible? I tell you, there is no unpardonable sin. He is very clear about that in the passage. Again, look at verse 31. Therefore I say to you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven men, but the blasphemy of the Spirit will not be forgiven men. So it isn't sin that isn't forgivable. It's this, the exception is found in the realm of the blasphemy. And you remember that blasphemy has to do with speaking. The very word itself is to speak stupid things. So it has to do with speaking. So it isn't sin. Sin can always be forgiven. There's no question with that. Sin is always forgivable. Whatever your sin is, anytime, any place, anywhere, there is genuine repentance can embrace all the forgiveness that God has given. In fact, what we really believe is that God has provided total forgiveness for every sin all the time, every time. It's already in place, that He doesn't need to forgive you at all tonight because He's already done that. Now, the acceptance of that is a whole nother ball game. So anytime you want to accept forgiveness of sin, it is yours. But then he brings up this subject of the blasphemy of the Spirit. Now, in my translation, it says against, and you remember that that's in italics, and it's not really there, so strike that thing out of there. So it's relational, but it's not against relational. It's of relational. So translate it, but the blasphemy of the Spirit, and that Spirit, which in my translation is capital S, which is probably true in yours as well, really should be a little s, so he's not talking about the Holy Spirit. See, again, let me remind you that what they did is, what the translators did is, they translated verse 31 in light of verse 32. I'm suggesting we should translate verse 32 in light of verse 31. And you say, what is the proof of that? Well, the proof of that is the entirety of what he's saying in the rest of the passage. Because as you walk through the rest of the passage, he hammers this thing again and again and again. So in verse 31, what you've got is, there's always forgiveness, anytime, any place. God is already put into place total, absolute forgiveness for everything that you have done that's been wrong. But when you go to talk about the Spirit, when we begin to deal with the Spirit, when we begin to deal with what's coming out of your spirit, when we begin to talk about nature, when we begin to talk about what you are inside, oh, that's a different deal. Because that is not a forgiving problem. In other words, forgiveness does not solve the problem of what your condition is in your spirit. Forgiveness you can embrace forgiveness in relationship to deeds, but when you go to what's inside of you in nature, forgiveness does not solve the problem. And we've given the illustration of when you got a transmission problem, you can change the spark plugs, but it doesn't solve the problem. Because the answer to a transmission problem is not spark plugs. God can forgive. But it isn't about He will forgive or won't forgive. He will forgive. But the problem is in the Spirit. And forgiveness doesn't solve that problem. There is a solution for the problem of the Spirit. It's the whole business of being born from above. It's the whole business of partaking in the divine nature. It's the whole business of a transformation in the nature itself, whereby God comes and does something in the human heart that you can't pull off. The answer to this nature thing is not a pat on the head. It's a radical revolution in the inner heart of your very being. So what he's suggesting in verse 31 is that yes, there's all abundance of forgiveness. Forgiveness is no problem. There is no sin that can't be forgiven. But I can't forgive the blasphemy, the stupid speaking, what's spilling out of the rebellion that spills out of your spirit. Because forgiveness just doesn't solve that problem. It doesn't change your spirit. That's going to take an act of a divine God moving within you, bringing transformation in the inner heart. Now, when he gets done with verse 31, this big theme, this supposition of truth, he moves us then to verse 32 and says, let's apply this. So it's the significance of application in verse 32. So he takes the truth that we just discussed in verse 31 and says, let's walk it into an example. Let me give you a application, how this plays out in real life. And he begins to say this in verse 32. Anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man. Hey, I'm standing right here before you, Jesus says. You Pharisees, you've been at me all day. Hey, in the grain fields you went after me. In the synagogue you went after me. And then you went after me in the conference room. And here you are again going after me. Okay, come on, bring it on. And you can do to me whatever you want to do. And guess what? I'm going to forgive you. You can count on it. You can take me out and nail me to a tree. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cry out, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So there's going to be plenty of forgiveness, so you don't need to worry about that. So you can do anything you want to do against me. You can say anything you want to say against me. And I'm just totally, absolutely, every time going to forgive you without question. But when you begin to rebel about what's coming out of me, when you begin to rebel about what is sourcing me, hey, you will remember, I went to John the Baptist and I went down into the Jordan River. And when I came out of that river, the Father, through the Spirit, filled me. And everything that's been coming out of my life has been sourced by and empowered by the Spirit of God Himself. Now, you're saying that what's coming out of me is Beelzebub. So you are actually rebelling against the very essence of the Holy Spirit that has filled my life and is sourcing all of my activities and is spilling through me. And when you begin to rebel against that which is sourcing me, then you've got a problem, because you are rebelling in your spirit against the Spirit. Did that make sense? So verse 32 is an application of what he has just said in verse 31, which is the big idea. Now, you're going to be able to walk through every one of these verses, verse 33, 34, 35, and on, and trace them all back to verse 31. For every one of these verses is simply explaining this big idea in verse 31. This basic supposition, this theme, this established principle. Plenty of forgiveness. Oh, there's plenty of forgiveness. But the Spirit, hey, that's not forgiven, because forgiveness doesn't solve that problem. That's not the cure for the rebellious spirit. The rebellious spirit is going to take a divine act of God, a death, a crucifixion, an indwelling, a coming, a birth, a change, a radical alteration in their inner heart. And that can only come by the Spirit. And when you begin to rebel against the very Spirit that's spilling out of me, that wants to do that in your life, what can we do? Where can we go? What is the solution? Now, he says, if that isn't clear for you, let me continue. And he moves you into verse 33, which we dealt with last week. And in verse 33, he says, I want to give you a story as told, a parable. Let me give this whole thing to you in parable form. You like stories? Hey, here's the parable. Either, verse 33, make the tree good and its fruit good, or else make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For a tree is known by its fruit. And he tells this parable. A tree thing. Come on, you know about trees. You've got one in your backyard. Come on, Pharisee. You raise these things. You pick the fruit off of these trees. You know this stuff. So this is sheer logic, man. And I'm giving you a parable. You don't go out to a tree that's got bad fruit and say, oh, a good tree has brought forth bad fruit. If the fruit is poisonous, the tree is poisonous. Now, that's exactly what you've been doing to me, he says. You've been looking at my fruit and saying, well, yeah, we admit, hey, those healings it's good. I mean, people's lives are changed. Yeah, well, and they're better Jews than they were before Jesus got done with them. You admit that. You admit, hey, raising the dead, well, yeah, that's probably a good thing. And yeah, the family sure enjoyed having him back. So that's a good thing. You admit that. You admit that my fruit is good, that what's coming out of me is good. But you say, what produces what's coming out of me, my tree, is bad. Now, you got to quit that. Because I'm telling you, he says, you cannot intermix that thing. If you're going to say my fruit is good, the miracles I do is good, the teaching I do is good, that the turning in the other cheek is good, that all the stuff I've been advocating is good, if you're going to say that's good, then you're going to have to say, he has a good tree. His nature and what produces him is good. You cannot intermix them. Now, if you want to say I have a bad tree, that's fine. If you want to say I'm from Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, empowered by him, that's fine. Then admit that everything I do is wrong. Everything I do is bad. Everything I'm performing is evil. You cannot intermix them. Now, folks, I don't like that truth at all. I think I'm with the Pharisees on this one. Because I have consistently said, well, I'm not all I ought to be, but I'm not all that bad either. And he, just plain flat, down to it, says, no, you can't intermix that. Well, I've got some things that I'm not a bad person inside. But I do have some things out here that I'm doing that probably aren't right. No, he says you can't do that. Because if you're not right outside, you're not right inside. And if you're not right inside, you're not right outside. You can't intermix that thing. That's an awful truth. Which means that if I'm not right inside and my nature is not right, it doesn't matter how good my fruit looks on the outside, it's still bad. Which was the message even of the Old Testament. That all the righteousness that's produced out of me is filthy rags. So anything that isn't sourced by the person of Jesus living through me absolutely doesn't matter how good it sounds or how nice it looks, it has the death ring about it. It has the filth connected to it. Do you realize what that does? That I could work my fingers to the bone for the church and it would still be filth because my tree is bad. And he says you just cannot intermix those things, which is awful. Because how are you going to justify yourself anymore? See, how can I justify myself? Well, yeah, that section of my life is not too good, but hey, I'm a good person. He says, no, you're mixing it. You're mixing it. Which drives us to absolutely down to it saying, oh, Jesus, here I am. Do something in my life because I don't have a chance without you. Because this is not about correction of the fruit. See, what he's saying is, he's not saying, well, you need to pray more, you need to do more ceremonies, no, he's not saying correct the fruit. What you got to do is you got to go after the tree, man. Go after the nature. Go after what you are inside. That's always been his message. Forget about the fruit and go after the tree, man. and get the nature. Oh, let God do something within your inner being. That's his emphasis. Now, verse 34, which is what we want to talk about tonight. We're calling this the speakers are revealed, because he really goes after them. And I'm so glad I'm just a humble Nazarene and not a Pharisee. Because when you come to verse 34, he starts out with what we're calling the statement of indictment. And he says, brood of vipers! Can't you just hear that ring? What it must have sounded like when he just looked him in the eye. And I doubt that he whispered that. I just can't conceive of that in my mind that he would. But just looked him in the eye and said, brood of vipers! And this isn't the first time, by the way, that this phrase has been used. John the Baptist used this same phrase in chapter 3 of Matthew, verse 7, when he looked at this same group and said, brood of vipers! So they've heard this before. And Jesus is going to use this same phrase again in Matthew chapter 23 in his final preached message. He's going to, right in the middle of the message, say, brood of vipers! Now, it's one thing to call, and we've discussed this some time back, and you probably don't remember, but brood of vipers is a very special kind of statement. Viper was the most poisonous snake that they had. Wasn't very long, about 1.5 feet. And hey, if it bit you, it would be maybe 5 minutes and you're dead. So it's the most poisonous that they knew of. And that's significant. And if he just called you a viper, that would be bad. But brood of vipers, oh, that's worse yet. Because the idea of brood of vipers is that there would often be that they would be within their mother, not born yet, and it would be almost time for birth, and these baby vipers inside their mother would eat their way out of their mother and kill their mother to get into life. So he's literally saying to these Pharisees, hey, you're still licking your lips from killing your mother. See, you are so selfish and so wrapped up in yourself and so filled with your carnal mind and so filled with the way you want to be and what you want and so filled with rebellion and so filled with a nature of resistance against God that you don't even care about your own mother, man. I mean, it's really strong. As he gives this strong statement of the indictment. And he's calling them out on their self-centeredness. Now, as you move on in the verse past that initial statement, which I want to get off of quickly, we want to move to the next statement. How can you, being evil, speak good things? How can you, being evil, speak good things? Now, he's going to support the support of the indictment. He's going to support what he just said, what he called them. Brood of vipers. Why am I calling you that? Oh, I'll tell you. How can you, being evil? Now, follow this. You is the subject of the sentence. And can is the verb. You can. Which becomes really significant, and we'll talk about that in a half a second. How, of course, puts it into question form. But you is the subject, can is the verb. Now, being evil is a phrase that's just stuck in there. And being is a participle. Isn't this exciting? Participle, which means it's an adjective modifying the subject. And evil is an adjective, not a participle, but it's an adjective modifying the subject. So being evil definitely modifies you. So he says, hey, I'm talking to you, you brood of vipers. And if you want to know why I'm calling you a brood of vipers, I'll tell you. Being evil is who you are. Now, being is the participle form of the me word, which is the I am that I am statement. In other words, all the I ams of Jesus are the me. This is that same word. In other words, it's a state of being. He says, I'm not talking about what you're doing. I'm not talking about the things you're even saying. I'm not talking about the activities you perform. I'm not talking about, oh, you are bad, you do this. I'm not talking about the fruit of your life. I'm talking about the inner core of your heart. It's not about the fruit. It's about the tree. And guys, your tree, you got a problem with your tree. The nature of your tree is evil. And it doesn't matter how much you camouflage, how much religion you put on top of it, how hard you work for the church, how much you do, how much you don't do, how many hours you pray, how much Bible reading you do. It doesn't matter if the tree isn't right. See, he's back to the same thing. It's an awful passage, isn't it? So I'm not saying these things in order to get you to do more religious stuff. I'm not trying to get you to tithe more money. I'm not trying to get you to offer more sacrifices. I'm not trying to get you to be motivated to go out and be evangelistic. I'm not trying to get you to do anything. I'm trying to pull you back, he says, and look at who you are inside. What your inner state is within. What is the tree that you are? Now, as you continue in verse 34, he talks about the supply of the indictment in verse 34. And it's all found in the can. How can you, being evil? I just laughed when I found this out because this is just phenomenal in my mind. Can, of course, is the verb of the sentence. You is the subject, can is the verb. Being evil is a phrase that modifies the subject. So he says, I'm talking to you evil ones. That's what he's saying. The evil ones can. Can is the Greek word dunamis, which you'll remember is where we get our word dynamite. And it's explosive in nature, and it's the idea of the activity of the flow. And there are two Greek words, and we've gone over this before, but you've probably forgotten. There's two Greek words, ischus and dunamis. Ischus, dunamis. They're both great words. Ischus is a focus on the resource itself. Dunamis is a focus on the activity and accomplishment and movement of that resource. So you look at God and say, wow, he's powerful. Whoa, he's mighty. God is really strong. He's got ischus. Yes, he does. Well, what's he doing? Absolutely nothing. Just sitting there. That's ischus. Oh, look out! There's the dunamis! What happened? God just began to move. And miracles are flowing, and people are being healed, and lives are being changed, and the Spirit of God is acting. And that's the dunamis, which is the activity of the ischus. Now, bring that into our verse, and what do you have? How can, dunamis? He says, how can you, being evil? What is your ischus? See, what is the ischus that's in your life? What is the nature within you? It's evil, he says. And that evil is doing what? It is on the move. And it is flowing. And it is accomplishing. And it's pulling off. And it doesn't sit back and just do nothing. No, this ischus that you have is going to be inactive. It's going to flow into your life. And as we get into this, you will note that he moves it in the rest of the verse 34. How can you, being evil, speak? Oh, this ischus that's in you is going to flow, and you know where it's going to come out of? Your mouth. Oh. And he brings up the whole idea of speaking. Now, what's so significant is he goes into this speaking and even ties it into the day of judgment, verse 36 and 37. And then you begin to search it through the rest of the scriptures, and you go to the book of James, and James is all over about this mouth thing. I mean, in 5 chapters in the book of James, every one of the chapters talks about your big mouth. Like sin somehow, like this nature thing that's in you, like whatever is within you just has to get a hold of your tongue. It just has to mouth off. It just can't keep still. And if your tree is good, it's going to mouth off. And if your tree is bad, it's going to mouth off. You're just going to be mouthy. It's just the way you are. And it's going to show up in your talk. And Pharisees, we've been listening to you. Look! Your disciples are picking grain on. Is it right to heal on the Sabbath day? We heard you yelling in the conference room about how you were going to... you're in league with Beelzebub. See, you couldn't keep still. Why didn't you just go home and take a nap? See, you couldn't do that. Why? Because the ischus that's in you had to flow and manifest itself. You just couldn't keep still. Likewise, Jesus says, I can't keep still. The ischus that's within me just has to... You think I can leave this multitude alone? I can't leave this multitude alone. I don't care if it's the Sabbath day or not the Sabbath day. I can't leave this multitude alone. I just got to heal all of them. They don't even need to tell anybody. But I got to heal them. I just have to do it. Why? Because the ischus that's within me demands this. I want to ask you what your ischus demands. Let's pray. Jesus, if I'm getting this, there's no problem in forgiveness. You're going to forgive me. You've already forgiven me. I can accept all of the forgiveness. But the problem I really got to deal with is this deal with the spirit that's within me, the nature of my inner being. And if I'm understanding this, Jesus, I can't intermix it. It's not I'm half and half, I'm kind of, well, there's some things, but other things aren't. And no, I can't mix it. I can't have good fruit and bad tree. I can't have bad tree and good fruit. I can't intermix it. Somehow, what I am inside, the ischus that's inside of me, the resource that produces me, what makes me who I am, the nature of my being, the way I think, oh God, if there's going to be any purity in my life, it has to be because you have gone to the depth of my heart and have radically revolutionized me inside. I have to be different inwardly. You've got to change me within. And we're not after tonight a little pat on the head so we'll feel better. We're not after tonight just a little forgiveness for, well, yeah, we slipped up there. Please forgive me. We're not after that, God. What we're after is we're after the radical, overwhelming result of the crucifixion, which is your resurrected life literally living within us. What we need is not more people to do more things. What we need is not more people to do better things. What we need is radically changed people who have the ischus of the Almighty within them, and it just spills out of their speaking, and they just can't. They just can't stop it. Because we will speak. Oh, Jesus. Let my words, let what spills out of me. I've been trying to curb all of that and manage all of that and organize all of that and correct all of that and change all of that when really I need to start in my nature. I give you the right tonight to change me within. Save me from myself. Heads are bowed. Can't intermix it, folks. Testimonies in your words. Are you open? Will you receive? Would you turn him loose? Moments of seeking. Be obedient.